incredibly inspirational for me when I was in grad school, and of course beyond. So it's great. This will be fun.
Made me feel old.
Yeah. Yeah, graduate school, it's not. Does it feel like you've been in grad school forever? That's what it felt like to me. But in a good way. I'd like to regress. In fact, I'm on a sabbatical year this year, so no teaching. And my pitch to my dean, you have to write something that would provide them warrant for providing you access to no teaching for a year. And my honest description of my sabbatical project was learning, going back to grad school, exploring areas that I have some expertise in, but deepening it, exposing myself to areas I didn't know I wanted to know more about. And it's been quite interesting. Not perfect, but interesting. And sometimes the road to development, David and I were talking about this on the train ride out, is not always linear and does involve the contextual dynamics of where you are and what's happening that can inspire you in ways that are unpredictable, right? It's a really fun part of the life of the mind that you all are already contributing to and hopefully will be engaged in for the remainder of your careers. So, how many of you were here, this is not a test by the way, in February when I gave some talks? Okay, good. This talk has nothing to do with that talk. They are completely unrelated. There's not even one overlapping slide. I did want to talk about some of the core theoretical framework that I was invested in at that time and still remain focused on largely, but I have made the choice to talk about some other things. And I know a number of you have been focusing on online intercultural learning, language learning, online intercultural exchange, telecollaboration, and these sorts of things. And I did come from the biennial conference in Krakow, Poland. It's actually not always there, although it might be there again. They've nominated themselves to host again. But this is one of the key groups, the intercollaboration group that Melinda and I and many others are part of, that put on research but also pedagogical innovation symposia every 2 years to focus on this issue of online intercultural exchange. So I keynoted that event, and so this is in part derived from that, but in part also different. I've tailored it a little bit to this audience and my thinking in the last 6 weeks or so since that event. While I was there, I noticed something. And here is what that noticing is. 25 years ago, when I first was exposed to online intercultural exchange in the early 1990s, the widespread advent of the internet, I thought to myself, goodness gracious, you know, we are no longer bound by the confines of the classroom and the temporal spatial dynamics there with the teacher and everything else. We can now communicate with people who are expert speakers or lingua franca speakers of languages we want to learn at our disposal. This is going to revolutionize language education. It's 2018, and we just had a conference in Poland, as I mentioned, and it is still the almost there project. This online intercultural exchange project remains incipient, remains used by 1, 2, maybe 3% of foreign language educators globally, possibly less. I do not know the stats for that. I'm shocked. And one thing I did notice that was very heartening, and I'll talk about that at the beginning of the presentation here, I have a little bit of a preamble. We're now working on ramping up online intercultural exchange in a big way. I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about my response to that ramping up, and that's the core of this talk. All right. So, just so we're all on the same page, all of you know this online intercultural exchange, telecollaboration idea, right? So you have partner classes typically that are separated by distance, but maybe even within the same nation state, and then they engage in some kind of typically structured exchange, right? We know that this is a cost-efficient way to access expert or native speakers. If you look at the trajectory of this, beginning in the early 90s until today, we've moved from linguistic to communicative competence, and from communicative competence to intercultural communicative competence. There's been a move in the field away from linguistic proficiency and toward what it means to be semiotically agile in late modern conditions where there's a mixing and melding of cultures and people. And by the way, one thing I would like to say at the beginning of this talk is when we talk about intercultural communication, we need to focus on culture and what that is, hence the title of the talk, Culture. And that will be the initial foray this evening, which is mostly theoretical, and then we'll get into more empirical stuff. But I would argue, and this is pretty obvious, but all human communicative activity is intercultural. You communicate across generational lines. You communicate across gender lines. So Carol Gilligan and many other feminist theorists have made compelling, empirically validated arguments, I think, that boys and girls in many cultures are fundamentally linguistically socialized into different speech communities, right? Deborah Tannen and many others have kind of made their name on gender acts and the ways in which biological males and females, as well as male and female presenting people, engage in communicative activity in different ways. Obviously, we also have great variation across social classes. And we have tremendous, within a speech, quote-unquote, speech community, right? So this idea of intercultural communication, I think, really needs to be kind of examined a little bit more carefully. The big thing for me, sitting in Rick Kern, for any of you who know that name's class, in 1994, when we were doing online intercultural exchange, was these new communicative repertoires that were afforded by the interpersonal mediation of age peers interacting with each other because they wanted to, in opposition to, and it's a wondrous, beautiful space, students in a classroom focusing on the aboutness of language. Its structure, its systematicity, the bits and pieces and what they're named, nouns, adjectives, adverbs, verbs, declensions, conjugations, etc., etc. Not that that's unimportant, but that's the predominant focus of instructed language education. And here, for the first time, I saw, within an instructed language education context, the importance of social relationship building and maintenance using language as a resource for that purpose. An entirely different orientation to creating or engineering conditions for learning. All right, so online intercultural exchange in the language area has also spread out to all other areas, right? The ability to participate responsibly and to contribute interculturally, to interculturally located academic, professional, social projects, etc., right? Global citizenship, and that's a really tricky term, but I have a parenthetical here, non-bindingly defined as a heightened capacity for interconnectedness and empathy that supersedes parochial nation-state identifications. We've all heard in the literature this focus on banal nationalism. We have a metric ton of that in the United States right now, where being a nationalist means fundamentally flag-waving and this veneer-thin manifest destiny ideology and all of these other sort of bits and pieces of what it means to be quote-unquote American. And this idea of critically understanding, whether you're in a language-focused course or not, critically understanding language and regions of the world where languages are spoken through the lens of imperialism and colonialism, and what that means in post-colonial and post-imperial imperialist areas. And then looking at even religious or faith-based frictions and exploring those. And this has been the focus, or become the focus, of a whole bunch of work that I think is critically important. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So there's been a bunch of stuff early on with book-length treatments anyway. Julie Bells and I had a book that was published in 2005 and 6. Sarah Guth and Fran Helm have this collaboration volume. And then Melinda Dooley with co-editors have a very nice 2016 edited volume on intercultural dialogue. We also, so that's mostly in the language learning area, we also have other approaches to thinking about online intercultural exchange, if you will, or what's sometimes called virtual internationalization, or the virtual internationalization term. We have Sarah Richardson's book, which kind of unpacks, and we can talk about this tomorrow or some other time, but this idea of cosmopolitanism as a potential educational goal. We have Michael Byram, who's been publishing in this area for many years, Principles and Practices in Education for Intercultural Citizenship is what he describes it. So not necessarily focused on certainly the linguistic proficiency alone, but what it means to have the semiotic resources to be a responsible intercultural person on this planet. And of course, Robert O'Dowd and Tim Lewis, both of whom were there in Krakow, have a recent book, Online Intercultural Exchange, which does focus on the language bit, but also has this virtual internationalization term. So you have people looking at virtual internationalization, and if you don't know what's happening on that front, I'll describe that in just a minute, but across all subject areas. So, as we know, the scaling up of online intercultural exchange, and this just came to the Thorne Krakow, Erasmus, which you know, physical mobility, right? Plus virtual exchange, it's now called EVE, funded in 10 or 12 million euros at this point. Hopefully will be refunded in the fall. 8,000 participants in 2018, 27,000 participants projected in 2019. Belinda and myself and many others have been involved in various projects that Robert O'Dowd and now Saki Acker and others have put together, evaluating Evolve. Evolve is one I'm participating in. It's rooted in Groningen, but it includes 9 or 10 different EU campuses. Evidence-validated online learning through virtual exchange, right? eTwinning serves 500,000 teachers, right? And then I mentioned peace studies or intercultural dialogue that's actually looking to create intersubjective spaces to explore the rips and the tears as well as the solidarities and alignments between highly divergent ideologies and cultures. And this is SOLIA, the Sharing Perspectives Foundation, Search for Common Ground, and less so, more focused on academic topics, COIL, which is at the City University of New York, Collaborative Online International Learning. So there's a whole bunch going on in this space. And in the scaling up of online intercultural exchange, we still have this idea of online intercultural exchange, but for all students, as part of potentially any sort of coursework, biology, chemistry, continental social theory, history, poetry, English, some other language is a lingua franca, right? And the idea here is to really expand what educational process means by embedding learning in dialogue, right? So all disciplines, all people, no barriers, etc. And this intercultural community ability is central to success in a mobile and globalizing world. I think that's very true. And in spite of all of the good things here, I also want to say, once we start thinking about broad scaling up, you get a reduction in innovation. You get a reduction in innovation, in localization. You get a one-size-fits-all, just like we have in almost every university in the world. If you take introductory organic chemistry, or introductory physics, or introductory name the language, and you might have slight variations. Maybe someone is doing a communicative competence-based approach, and someone else might be doing something earlier, grammar translation. But you're still getting an aboutness of the language and a focus on language as an object of study, right? And this, so within the concept of pedagogical innovation, I don't want us to be stuck in what Michel Foucault described as an episteme, right? And his example was, what do botanical gardens, military reviews, prisons, and schools all have in common? Right? So you can think military reviews, prisons, and schools. So you can think institutions, right? But then a botanical garden, how does that fit? So with this example of Foucault's episteme, all of those organized systems of activity are premised on the same dynamic. One organism or one person or very small group controls the actions and interactions of everything else in that system. Military, top-down. Schools, top-down. Prisons, top-down. Botanical gardens, a gardener or group of gardeners, top-down, right? So what I'd like to do is really blow up with the idea of being constructive and positive about it, some aspects of online intercultural exchange that still allow for innovation and kind of radical shifts in how we think about doing this. But we're going to take a little while to get there. So that was all the preamble. Here's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to complexify culture and move toward this idea of culturing. We're going to talk about the importance of culture in terms of tool mediation. And some of you may be familiar with my work on cultures of use of internet communication tools. So we'll talk briefly about mediation, cultures of use, and I will introduce an idea to many of you called desire lines. And then I will, at the very end here, talk about online intercultural exchange pedagogies on a climb of wildness. And the two asterisk case studies are rooted in more formal instructive educational contexts. What we need to think about is, should I be presenting these, or should I just move on to the wild stuff? And we'll see how long it takes me to get there. I'm not sometimes as quick as I should be getting through my material. So we can jump ahead, or just stop. It's okay. This is relatively informal, right? It's going to be all right. Okay, so from culture to culture, if we're going to talk about intercultural communication, shouldn't we have a sense of culture? And I am shocked by the treatments that I see in textbooks, the treatments that I see in even some sort of positivist anthropological work. So I am taking more of a cultural studies approach here. But we'll begin with James Clifford, a very well-established anthropologist, who first begins by saying, look, culture is temporal, emergent, and disputed. Now, what does that mean? So oftentimes when you think about culture, you think about stuff. You think about, or maybe you think about bounded temporal events, holidays, festivals, right? Or you think about flags, or you think about monuments, architecture. And it's not that that's not culture. But I would like to say that in every single way that matters, in the process ontology of the unfolding moment that informs who and how we become, who and what we are, we need to think about culture as a process, right? That it's temporally embedded. It isn't out of time. It's not a bunch of stuff. It's temporal, and it's changing, and it's oftentimes disputed. Homi Bhabha describes it, and again, this is just a little tough sledding, just for a minute. The whole talk is not like this. It is in the emergence of the interstices, that means an in-between space, the overlap and displacement of domains of difference, that the intersubjective and collective experiences of nationness, community interest, or cultural value are negotiated, right? So here we have this idea of the experiences that we have as physical embodied humans in environments with other people. That's culture. Not the stuff, but the process. Terms of cultural engagement are productively performative. We perform culture. Culture is something one does. It is not an is thing. It's a verb, right? In the adjective way. And I say this because you've all heard of the 4 F's, which by the way was new to me. I heard this at the Krakow conference, right? Food, fashion, flags, folklore, bam! Culture, check. Okay, now we can get to the other stuff. Drives me crazy. My own linguistic community, applied linguistics, talks about C1, C2, C1, C2, right? Home culture, other culture, target culture, What does that mean? What can that possibly mean? If you're taking intercultural communication seriously, and you're looking at cultural variation across genders, performed genders, cultural variation across social classes, certainly cultural variation across communities that may be physically and in other ways separate or distinct from one another. We really can't talk about C1, C2 in any way that's helpful to anyone, I would say. And there is a fix here. I'm not going to leave you with all of the water in the bath thrown out. Don't worry, that's not this. But I do suggest that we always problematize this, yeah? Culture is not so much a what, as I mentioned, but a dynamic of when, where, and how. That's culture. Phenomenological primacy, fancy word for what you're experiencing right now in the process ontology of the unfolding moment, right? This moment, bam! When I click my finger, okay, now, how's it? Am I still on? Am I back on? Okay. So those little monkey moves, right? I mean, you were watching that in real time thinking, that guy's an idiot, he's never being brought back to UAB. But the point is, the phenomenological primacy is not your reflection now back on that. It is the moment that you experience precisely what is happening, right? Actions attended to as interactionally relevant to participants. So when we talk about C2, right? How about we attend to culture in ways that are obviously relevant to the participants in that interaction, before foisting or positing all this ideology or baggage onto them as cultured beings. I think that's reductionistic, it's unfair, and we need to really do a better job of unpacking this, right? So when we think about culture as process interaction, what are we talking about? And language use as social action is a big piece, right? You get this from the pragmatics literature. I'll talk about EMCA in just a minute. But you do or perform culture. Now, it is possible, of course, that a monument or a festival or food types also evoke particular kinds of valuations and meanings. Of course. But it is the evocative nature and the moment and time and place within which those evocations occur that is actually culture. Otherwise, I mean, it may or may not be relevant to trying to understand what's going on at a moment in time. A little more technical, but from the ethnomethodological conversation analysis tradition, we have different forms of turn economy. We have different response latency that some speech communities may have. We have different ways in which sequence organization may play out if you're making a request or declining an invitation or whatever that might be. We have certain kinds of action formation, certain principles of recipient design, how we as individuals who are communicating with other individuals or groups design our utterances, perhaps unknowingly to us, in order to serve our communicative needs. Irving Goffman had a really lovely way of talking about this. You have signs given, right? Those are the ones you intend. You also have signs given off. All the stuff that you do and say and emote and express with your face, like when my daughter says, "Sure, Dad." Okay, so that's not saying, "Sure, Dad." Those are very different. Hold on, let's do it. "Sure, Dad," or "Sure, Dad." Okay, so I tried to maintain the prosody, but a whole bunch is going on in the ways in which that's presented. Those are the signs given off. That's why I make my children stand at attention and say things again and again until they have no affect at all, like Botox lasers. I'm kidding. I don't do that. But I do tell them that signs given off is an issue, that they might want to gain more objective control. Yes, now you're worried, aren't you? Yeah. See all of you worried. Frames and ritual forms of engagement. Irving Goffman talks about this. He has some beautiful examples. How do you know what someone's saying when they're actually talking? Only because there's a cultural frame. You're in an office hours situation, you know what a teacher's supposed to say, and you know what you're supposed to say, also called scripts, right? You don't walk into a restaurant and say, yes to the waiter, what would you like to eat tonight? It's like that's the wrong way, right? I mean, all these ways in which we have cultural scripts and expectations of behavior inform what works. Michael Silverstein, some of you may know his work, the discursive interaction itself brings sociocultural meanings and values into the here and now. So it isn't that things outside of the immediate surround can't be relevant culturally. It's that they need to be made relevant to the participants before we can foist, quote unquote, C2 onto the interaction in any kind of reasonable way. Okay. So what am I talking about then? And here's the suggestion. Culture, fundamentally, is simply a set of anticipatory heuristics which support semiotic and interactional agility, right? Now what this means is the practice of culture, doing culture, performing culture, involves a whole bunch of partially shared and lexical relations with people, right? And bodily experiences and such. But culture itself in the moment, right now, my culture, everything that informs what I'm doing at this moment is fundamentally informed by my prior experience, which allows me to sort of predict next action, right? And fundamentally, that, I think, is what culture actually is. Everything about you that makes you make fewer errors in life, or do your life a little bit better, and understand a little bit more deeply what's happening. And we can look at this, quote unquote, cross-culturally, across speech and obvious cultural differences, or we can look at that within our own households, across generations or across gender lines, et cetera, right? So then this means, if this is the case, then intercultural communication really means this, building the capacity for adaptive and anticipatory semiotic agility. That's our goal. And when we talk about words like competence, which I really detest, competence looks back. It's knowledge attained, as Vygotsky would describe it. When you talk about a term like agility, it's forward-looking, it's anticipatory. right? And I think that's where we need to go in terms of thinking what our targets are for the kinds of work we want to do. Now, Emil Durkheim, who I've been annoyingly reading a lot of lately, talks about normativity as the social fact, not a social fact, not a social fact, the social fact, normativity, the social fact. But it is the social fact which in fact will change or vary across communities and maybe across time. So if I'm sort of tearing down the C1, C2 or the 4 Fs of culture, what am I replacing it with? And this is not going to be new to any of you, and it's not my idea really. But we can still focus on things like cross-cultural approaches. So in Spanish-speaking areas, not maybe everywhere, but in many places, you have an interlocutor-oriented apology strategy, the Sculpin, and yet you have all these Americans, in particular, learning listening, which is a speaker-centered apology strategy, which works if someone dies, right, or something like that. But otherwise, if you bum somebody out, or you need to have this hearer-oriented apology strategy, typically, right? Much more often than in English. So you can do some things at this cross-cultural level. Then we have this intercultural approach, right? Actual investigations of groups in interaction with each other. Chinese and Americans, or maybe upper and lower class individuals within the same community, right? As Bourdieu has done. And you can actually look at the recurrent dynamics and the problems between kinds of communities, and you can pull out some of that and teach it explicitly. It might work. I'm most excited, if you haven't guessed already, around what the scholars describe as the interdiscourse approach, and I quote them here. Investigation of how and under what circumstances concepts such as culture are produced by participants as relevant categories for interpersonal, ideological negotiation. So rather than taking this thing of culture, especially something as blunt as C2, and imposing it on 1 billion Chinese people, or 350 million Americans, right? Let's look at what happens within the interaction itself to see what aspects of culture might be variable, might be consistent, might be oriented to by participants as important, might be not noticed at all, which would be an opportunity for you to pedagogically mediate those instances, to bring out those interesting cultural fault lines that may not be assessed or acknowledged by participants, right? So it's not that I'm saying, if it isn't oriented to, it's not important. What I'm saying is we need to be doing this work of really looking at the ways in which culture is a form of performance, and then orienting to it in ways that then articulate the communicative processes that we can actually focus on more discreetly. All communication, friends, comes down to morphosyntactic realizations in terms of the vocal stream or the written stream. Facial expression, bodily diathesis, we're leaving that aside for the moment. But, so it does all boil down to that. But there's also all this other stuff going on. Okay, that's what I want to say about culture, all right? Nuance it, right? Treat it with more dignity, respect, and profundity, right? That's my suggestion there. All right, so culture, again, it's not just stuff, it's what we do. So here is an example, I think a very concrete example, of how culture and internet tool use converge in interesting ways. Now I'm going to do a little build-up to this through learning as experience and mediation of the Vygotsky perspective, and then I'm just going to talk about some fun data, which I'm almost positive you will like. All right, so coming back to this idea of experience and doing, it's been around in the activity theory, and for that matter, by the way, activity theory rooted in Vygotsky, a Marxist philosophy of mind and development, rooted in Marx. Marx talks a lot about sensuous, practical, critical activity. Before you get all titillated, he doesn't mean sensuous in that way. He means in the embodied sense, in the I'll use another word though, in a kernel, sociological, and psychological sense. Meaning the body. Yeah, okay. Maybe too much of a double entendre. So, as Bonnie already described, you are what you do, and what you do is firmly and inextricably embedded in the social matrix of which every person is an organic part. Let's look at language. Michael Tomasello, use-based linguistics. All linguistic knowledge derives from the comprehension and production of specific utterances on specific occasions of use. Now, you might think, why on earth, if you think about this deeply, you might think, did he really need to tell us that? Right? Because when are you going to learn those 50 vocabulary items, except for when you're actually working on learning those 50 vocabulary items? Or when are you going to be in a pragmatic situation where something you've been doing wrong forever is finally brought to your attention and you're like, oh my God, right? It all happens, of course. Everything we know about language and culture, right, come through the ways in which we perform or engage in real time, right? And this idea, of course, of neuroplasticity, all these experiences, linguistic ones or more broadly, human ones, have to do with this idea of our particular biological vessels being highly adaptive to experience. It's called neuroplasticity. Everything we do strengthens or mitigates the relations between certain types of synaptic relationships, right? So, that means things like home, social, and recreational context matter. Total volume of effortful engagement matters. Development of viable identities and social roles in the new language matter, beyond that of the flat social proxy of student, right? Friend, author, expert, teammate, whatever. And of course, this also means that, yes, engineering conditions for learning matter deeply. That's what we do, right? Teachers are the keystone species in the information and developmental ecology that are learning spaces, right? Okay. So Jim and I, Lantoff and I have written this, and I've written a bunch of other stuff. Cultural historical psychology, which basically is rooted in the work of Vygotsky. And many of you have seen this triangle. You have a person doing something, the object of their activity, mediated by tools like language, which is a kind of tool, a semiotic tool, or a hammer, right? If you're building something, or digging a hole, maybe you have a shovel. Right, so human activity is mediated by both symbolic but also material artifacts. Tools shape radically the actions we produce in the world. Didn't I give this example when I was here in February, or maybe it was in the... So if you want to dig, you can go like this, like a dog, right? So if I'm digging with a shovel, look, I mean, my body morphology, that's where this mediation and morphology of action comes in. My body is not doing at all the same thing, digging like this versus doing this, right? And my brother, who is both a rancher and a commercial fisherman, has a backhoe. So he digs like this, with a little joystick, and this big bucket goes, right? So look, there's nothing related in what my body's doing, but there is something happening out in the world. And what is happening in the world is radically influenced by the mediational means or affordances we put in place. That's why as teachers, come on, help me. What do teachers put in place? What mediational means do you have at your disposal in classroom context? Throw some out, come on. Think of one. Technology, blackboards, PowerPoints, syllabi or curricula, textbooks, right? Writing implements, small group dyad work. Learners, lectures, bringing in people from the outside, realia, right? I mean, all of these things mediate the activity, right? And in shaping external actions, mediational means also affect the internal cognitive cultural state of mind. It's a bidirectional influence. Certainly this is the case in language, as we know from the linguistic relativity research, as contested as it is. Okay, so we also know that if you look at this, you have a person trying to do something mediated by various means or tools, but you also have Engestrom's model. So now you have the same subject-object mediating artifact relationship, but the subject is within a community, and those communities are mediated by rules or routine sorts of behaviors. And another term, division of labor, fundamentally, it's what it is you are doing in that community, right? How you contribute to that community, right? And of course, Culturally organized systems of activity don't stand alone. So your classroom might look like this, with maybe a student or a teacher could be looked at here, but then you have the community of the class and the rules that undergird that, and you're either a teacher or a student or whatever, and you have all those tools we just looked at, and you have some sort of learning outcome expected, right? But you also have other classes, or maybe your school is part of a school district, right? Or it could be that you're learning something in school, but you also have some sort of apprenticeship, or something that's outside of school entirely. But these share an object. These share an orientation to a broader goal of the activity itself, right? Okay, so that's the theoretical framework we're going to use to talk about the following example. Now, I set up an online intercultural exchange with some colleagues, and we were working hard to do everything we could to make this an amazing experience for teachers and learners of French in the United States, and teachers and learners of English in France, right? And we're at the third, our final, synchronous video chat, where small groups of American students are with small groups of French students. And this is what I experienced. I will read it aloud. Think of it as reader's theater. Do you ever use reader's theater in class? Never? Oh, that's an underutilized methodology. Reader's theater is amazing. In subtext. Okay. Kate says, and these are all the Americans, I love Francois, that's their key pal who's on the video with me. He's so terrific. I would talk to him like doing this, the synchronous chat session, video chat, or like on Instant Messenger, I would talk to him, I just don't like writing email. Steph, her friend, says, I would talk to him too. If he was on AOL, I'd talk to him all the time. He's a sweetie. Kate returns and says, he's so cute. I love him. Francois is the best person ever. And I'm like, wow, you really like Francois. So I say, so you haven't been, following up with email. It's a required part of the course, by the way. So you guys follow up with email, or says, I hate writing emails. And I'm like, really? So are the email exchanges just not as dynamic as this, or it's like, no. And Grace says, yeah, but I think it's also because we communicate with a lot of people now through instant messaging, so that's how I talk to my friends at different colleges. And here, Steph says in line 9, 10, Grace says, we don't send emails back and forth to each other to catch up. We just talk using instant messaging. That's what they describe it, talking. It's very like, Steph, yeah, it's just like what we're used to, and I'm still like, what is going on here? I say, so you don't use email that much normally? And Steph says, I almost never do. I use it for teachers and stuff. Grace says, teachers, yeah, or my mom. Okay? So, and this seems so trivial, right? This seems so trivial. But total volume of effortful engagement, building and maintaining relationships of significance is what drives language learning. And the tool was the right tool for these individuals across lines, generational lines, power lines, mom, volleyball coach, yeah, sure, that's fine, right? Teachers, right? But email was an impediment for age-peer interaction, right? And so I explored this a bit more, and I ended up developing this idea of a cultures of use of artifacts. And by the way, I cannot tell you how surprised I was, because for me, email was, I email anyone. I mean, up, down, near, proximal or distal in terms of social relationships, email is a go-to, every person tool. And I would submit, and I've had some critique in the literature about cultures of use, like, well, my students will use email. And I said, exactly. They have a different culture of use regarding that internet communication tool. We're going to go back to this, right? So cultures of use, that fundamentally all artifacts, and this is true of anything within the Vygotsky tradition. Hammers, my brother's, rancher and commercial fisherman, a hammer is a tool with many uses that he can wield well. I use a hammer as a paperweight, okay? It's fundamental value to me. So the historically sedimented associations, qualities, and values that accrue to internet communication tools through quotidian use. So for these Americans, email is great across generation and power lines, inappropriate for age-peer relationship building, right? This really presents a new challenge to the top-down organization of online intercultural exchange. If we can't even choose the right tool, or before they get out the gate, to have the bumbling and difficulty of trying to create these relationships of significance, and the tool mitigates it, that's a real problem that we need to be aware of, right? So here's an example of the opposite. Mediational facility. Kirsten was really upset when she came into the end of the term interview. This is in the same course. She's like, I'm going in there and like, I was so mad. And then she says, about her key pal, Olivier. She says, out of the blue, Oliver IM'd me, instant messaged me. We went on for probably close to 6 hours that day alone on instant messenger, right? And I said, so 6 hours? She says, yeah, just that day. We talk every day, right? And I said, really? Because the class was now done, right? And she goes, yeah, every day. And like, for that long every day? She was like, no, like 15 or 20 minutes worth, but usually twice or 3 times a day. And it's about an hour a day that she chats, mostly in French, with her key pal on IM, when during the semester, using email, none, 0. Okay? So before, because I wanted to know, what do you learn from this? I mean, tell me. And I said, so what did he help you with? And she says, this is French, versus versus dans versus versus, that kind of stuff. A more in-depth vocabulary for sure. And she goes on to say, I was like, how am I supposed to say, like, for example, so like the de and thing, de la campagne, à la cité. She was not a particularly strong French student. Whatever, stuff like that. But I was like, because I couldn't get that from a dictionary. Listen to this. I couldn't get that from a dictionary. I said, so that's something you had to have a little help with? She goes, yeah, how am I supposed to learn that stuff? It's not in the grammar books, expressions like that and other things. It was fun. Okay, hold on. That's the only thing in the grammar books. Stuff like prepositions of location. That's all there is in grammar books. There's nothing else in grammar books but that stuff. So what does this tell you about learning structure and learning proficiency? 3 years. Seat time in a French course, and she was still working on prepositions of location. She has a couple of 1-hour chats online in a synchronous chat channel, chosen, voluntary, right, with somebody, and she learns the grammar that is the only real focus of instructed language education, right? I find this incredible, right? So interpersonal mediation is developing. So instant messenger in this case, I'm not broadly generalizing at all. In this case, for these participants, synchronous chat infused life into this dead relationship that hadn't even really started. Immediate and explicit linguistic feedback was part of a socially meaningful relationship, right? And as Bakhtin has said, we acquire language through a process of assimilation, more or less creative, of others' words, not the words of the language, some abstract entity sitting out there in space, timeless, spaceless. You learn other people's words, right? And this is a beautiful example, I think, of this. So you may be wondering, what can we learn? Well, when you have a relevant vernacular tool, right? You have dynamic interaction, extensive relationship development in ways that were not possible without that tool. And in the opposite case, you didn't see that develop ever, except during the 3 synchronous video chats where they were able to have that real-time engagement. There's another talk that I can give on the human response tempo to interaction that probably privileges the high social presence of synchronous media. It's not this talk, but that has something to do with it, I think. So let's look at this cultures of use idea a little further. And again, to be clear, this simply is, there are no neutral tools ever, right? All tools are cultural tools. We have associations, positive and negative, or for that matter, kind of neutral or in between. What's the line? Technology is neither good nor bad. Neither is it neutral. It's meaning all tools are contingent on their use, right? So in 2006, 3 years after the study, email still used primarily across hierarchical boundaries. IM reportedly used by all students. Using email with friends living in different time zones, however, illustrated an interesting difference in cultures of use. One person said, there's more sentimentality to email than instant messaging. Now, admittedly, from the time the data was gathered, this is 4 years later, all right? So things change. Like everyone who used to be on Facebook, if you're a young person, is now on Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. We'll talk about Facebook in a minute. All right, so here's one person who's almost harkening back to the epistolary conventions of the Victorian era, right? Where you wrote beautiful long letters to each other. Let's look at an alternative case. Sometimes it's hard to think of something to fill up a whole email, like they send a really long one or something. My ex-girlfriend used to say, why don't you just send email? And I'm like, yeah, why don't I just kill myself? Okay? Meaning, obviously, this was before, I hope, it was his ex-girlfriend. Although this could have contributed, you never know. But I mean, here's someone you love, you want to communicate with, ostensibly, and email was the wrong tool for that job.
Was this the same
No,
on the other
different.
side, on the French side?
No, these were both American students. Both American students. Another American student, in response, 2015, when I had this amazing epiphany, and I'm like, oh my God, grandparents and parents and kids, transgenerational social media, it's amazing. This 19-year-old hands it up. And I'm like, yes? And he said, yeah, oh yeah, I use Facebook. And I have my friends in two categories, a small one for my real friends and a very large one for everyone else. Like people in their 20s, parents, teachers, and families. I call a big group old people and see that they are on Facebook all the time. Almost none of my real friends use Facebook anymore, we're all on Instagram, right? So what this is telling us is a couple of things. Tool choice and the ways in which culture, as performed, involves complex, oh, by the way, all that stuff is in this or in earlier pieces that are referenced in this article. So you can enjoy that in your leisure time. Or if you have insomnia, I highly recommend this. Okay, next up. Tool choice is really something. We really need to think about this. And so here's the metaphor, all right? Have you heard of desire lines? This is an example. So here's the design path. This is my telecollaboration project, online intercultural exchange project, use email. It was awesome. Wait for it. Not. Okay. And there's the user experience, right? This happens everywhere, right? Traces of preferred or lived activity should be taken into account as we design technology-mediated environments. And increasingly, we're not doing that. We're using learning management systems. We're using box-off-the-shelf video conferencing systems. Am I saying that that's bad? I am not saying that. I am saying, though, that, and I'll explore this in the latter part of the talk, vernacular cultures and vernacular tools also have a very real place if the goal is relationship building and maintenance and not purely instructed language learning activity. So you can combine this top-down and bottom-up. This is a university campus. It happens to be the campus that I went to as an undergraduate, a few years ago. And they did not pave any of this. They let people walk for a year. And then they put down the paths. That's why you get weird stuff like this. Or you have all of these double angles here. It's like there's one stairway, they could have put a single path in, but they didn't. And you have all these little areas where, you know, obviously people were making paths, and here, that's a beautiful desire line. You think they're going here, but they're not. They're going over here, and they were just walking through the grass. So they actually, and you still get desire lines, I'm sure, but they actually did a good job of top-down, bottom-up. And in case you might recognize it, it's David Block on our way to the room today. And here's David and me, and here's a beautiful desire line. This is just below down here, right? And yeah, we were lost. And here's another one, Cloudy and David, right? And I did not prompt them to do this. Look at those guys wrecking your grass. We were walking around, and the path went like this. And this is our buildings right over here, right? And they just walk straight down the desire line, right here, you can see it, right? This is all over our world. Pay attention, right? This is what I would suggest for all of us, Pay attention, right? This is very important. It has consequential potential. Every case and scenario can be localized and specific, and you dip a ladle into a beautiful crystalline web of semiosis. What will emerge? You have to see. I mean, this is not supposed to be a positivist statement. It's supposed to say, pay attention and see what's there. All right. So if we're thinking about cultures of use and this idea of strong mediation, and I did talk about this, but not this slide at all, we talk about Latourian dynamics, where you have networks of actants of both human and non-human varieties. So the example Latour gives is if you see sheep running and they have a visual affordance of a fence and they turn, where's the agency in that scenario? It might seem obvious. Well, sheep are a little bit more sentient than fences, which are obviously not alive at all, but there's something about that dynamic that caused the sheep running in a group to turn, right? And what is that? And how does agency live in a distributed way between human and non-human actants in complex networks of activity? Add to this the displaced agency. Sorry, I know this is fast. I'm coming back tomorrow. You guys are stuck with me tomorrow too. So you can ask me about this more if you want. But the displaced agency of high technology artifacts were designed by a human, right? But the technology itself is just electricity and some computer code. And there's no human there, right? But you do have human intentions and human actions that manifest in displacement as features of a technology environment that you're using. I mean, this should be pretty obvious, right? No? Yeah? Okay, we'll talk about it tomorrow. But anyway, the idea is different. Mediation implies shifts in the morphology of action, right? From digging to digging, right? But also, shifts in morphologies of action shift conditions of possibility for relationship development, for learning, for all that stuff, right? So I want to build a pedagogy that is at least partly established on conditions of possibility associated with use-value relations. And we're not going to go into a big Marxist discussion on exchange value versus use value. I will simply say, however, my students, yours may be much better, typically associate particular kinds of discrete tasks that they need to complete, and in exchange for a grade, and you get enough grades and they exchange those for a degree, and they get enough degrees and they exchange those for employment or credentials of some kind, and that is an exchange value dynamic. It isn't the worst thing ever, but it is definitely emblematic of a kind of, I think, deleterious condition that some people would call alienation, where you're doing something because of its value relation to something else, not because it has intrinsic value to you. So anytime we can think about creating environments that have more ecological validity in the lives of our learners, in the semiospheres they want to live their lives through and with, I think it's our obligation, our ethical commitment to try to do that. Okay, so we're coming to the point now where I have some case studies, and I have one that's very bound in educational context, and a few others that are very brief, that are totally outside of formal schooling in terms of where some of this activity happens. So we just try and do it. Maybe I'll be quick. Okay. All right. So this kind of wellness. So firstly, I want you to like. And like is this, the language integrated knowledge education approach, which is possibly the best acronym ever. How can you not like, right? And this comes because I work at an institution that is an access university, I think is the technical term. So we have almost open admission, right? And we have students who are very well prepared for college. We have many people coming from later in life, so they might be in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and coming back for their first time ever to university. We have many, many first-generation college students. And my belief is that language and disciplinary academic discourse competence is at the heart of the difficulty, especially for first-generation college students or people returning to university. So that's what this addresses. I've written this up. It was a nearly funded project, and so I was so irked they didn't get funded, I turned it into a publication. So here's the idea, and there is an OIE element. It's basically pay attention to the explicit morphosyntactic realizations that are at the center of your academic commitment. Doesn't matter what it is. See those big eyes. Teacher professional development. What are the key terms, right? Do you talk about things like, as a collocational pattern, teacher cognition, right? You might not. Some communities do, some don't. Do you call it teacher education or teacher professional development? Those are loaded. Some people would be like teacher, or teacher training. Some people hate that word training, right? I mean, we need to attend to the specificity of words, just as surgeons would choose very particular instruments for the kinds of things they're needing to do, right? So the idea here is academic discourse competence, fundamental to student success, not just in an L2, L3, L4, as in Europe, but also in their first language. Just because you speak English as a native speaker, or Catalan, or whatever, doesn't mean you know how to academically perform as a relevant, central person in academic community in that language. So the idea is really simple. You get, although the actualization might be difficult, you get students interacting with other students who may be more expert in those languages, but share architecture, philosophy, biology, right? One of my biggest converts to this at my campus is Todd Rosensteel, who's a biologist. And he now goes into his I think it's 101. It's the early, some courses begin at 1, but I think it's a 100 level course. He walks in, there's 600 students, and he says, first words out of his mouth, I am here not to teach you biology, but to teach you the language of biology. Because without the language, you cannot fully participate in knowledge-producing communities associated with biology, ecology, etc. Right? And this is really, any of you know the work of Anne Spard, participation versus acquisition metaphor, right? Well, so her recent work, 2007, she talks a lot about comognition, which she fully acknowledges is a really awkward neologism, which is the combination of communication and cognition, right? But her argument in mathematics, pretty distal from anything linguistically related. Thinking is a form of communication. Learning is modifying and extending one's discourse. And her claim is that in the field of mathematics education, there is a co-equivalence of linguistic expertise in the area of math and mathematical concept expertise and development. That these are conjoined, right? Jim Cummins, who many of you may know, the L1 at deeper levels of conceptual and academic functioning, there is a considerable overlap or interdependence across languages, right? So L1 and L2. If you have a weak L1, you're not going to necessarily develop academic discourse competence in your L2, right? Strong L1, strong L2. So the idea here is you don't have foreign language bounded in a classroom, rather you think about L1 and L2 as mutually supportive, right? And I think this is particularly the case for first generation college students, something like this, right? All right, really it could be done very, very simply. What terminology is specific to your field or your course of study? What recurrent phrases and collocations, words that glue together, do you notice in textbooks, research articles, lectures, etc.? What high-frequency language patterns seem most relevant for? And then fill in the blank, right? Lab reports. How do you document computer code or annotate architectural renderings, right? We don't even know that stuff. So if you're doing English or Catalan or Spanish for specific purposes, these are all genre specificities that we would want to learn, right? Engaging in post-structuralist analysis of the public sphere. We have David Block. He'll be talking about that, sort of. Maybe not post-structural. So anyway, look at this. So these are just wordles. This is meant to be illustrative, right? So calculus. There's a bunch of words that show up when you look at calculus tests. These are all taken from Wikipedia introductory pages. Ecology, architecture, sociology, chemistry, linguistics, continental philosophy. You also can look at things like the Michigan Corpus of Academic Spoken English, classroom discourse, with a focus on quasi-technical terms like matrix, matrix model, matrix metaproteases, right? And you'd have to figure out how matrix is used in actual spoken discourse, not just texts. Right? The term hypothesis, right? And you can figure out inductively how certain key terms that keep recurring and that you don't quite get are used in contexts that relate to your academic performance, right? So the idea here is that Like presents a way for online intercultural exchange to help each other, right? To develop a mastery of academic or technical discourses, which are really important to success at university life. right? Explicit attention to disciplinary genre conventions, right? Whatever that might be. How do you ask a good question if you're a biologist or a linguist? If you're asking a question in class. Command of specialized language necessary for performing academic identities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a data-driven approach, right? So I think it's a potentially very powerful one that could be adapted to whatever an individual's context would be. So the ideas of something like this light approach is it addresses a whole bunch of problems. It helps people bridge from basic, say, language requirements at the university, which you have in Europe and way watered down in the US, 2 years of a foreign language. That doesn't really get you to specific genres or registers of the language, certainly not in an academic context. So it can help you bridge there. It also takes language from sitting inside of a language classroom and makes it relevant across subject matter content, right? This is happening through CLIL, it's happening in languages across the curriculum, it's happening in a bunch of ways, but with less emphasis on making explicit and learnable the linguistic assets that will allow you to fully participate. And if you can fully participate, you have a better chance of being successful, of aligning with that field, being recognized as someone who can do the talk of architecture, biology, mathematics, whatever, right? Okay, this last stuff is mostly fun, I hope. Not that the other stuff wasn't fun. But this is moving back a little bit towards desire lines, or the rewilding of online cultural exchange. So David Block and many others, Fruth and Wagner, 1997, right? The general preoccupation with the learner in instructive settings at the expense of other potentially relevant social identities is a real problem. It's like language acquisition and how we design pedagogical courses. If you look at innovative work in the sciences now, they treat kids, especially like junior high, high school kids, so 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, right? How do they treat them? As really crappy, very poor scientists, not as students of science. They're just really bad at science, but they're scientists. They're doing real investigative work. They're going out and exploring a watershed, or they're looking at counting bugs in their backyard in a square meter of roped off area, or whatever. They're scientists. They're just not very good at it yet, right? And that's how I think we should be thinking in some ways about language learners. You may not be able to perform an identity of, someone who's a compelling interlocutor yet, right? But we should be encouraging you toward that rather than mastery of, say, a system, some of which you may never use or find applicable, right? So this idea of online intercultural exchange in the sort of bounded institutional sense has been critiqued in the literature. Hannah and Denouy describe it as safely within the virtual classroom, right? But predominantly speak from institutionally bounded subject positions, my term, of student or learner, rather than interlocutor, expert, friend, whatever, right? And here's a great line, I love this. Online intercultural interaction, I'll describe what I mean here, may help participants move beyond the self as the exotic little foreigner or the other, right? And do you know this 2003 Hannah and Denouy study? It's lovely. They just look at the ways in which students orient to activity in these online news forums in different ways. And not necessarily the most linguistically proficient ends up being the most successful, because what they did is they actually participated in the topic of debate, rather than, I'm a learner, I just want to learn some French, so if you guys don't mind, keep talking about politics, I just want to, if you can help me with my French, that'd be great. And they're like, we're here to debate, and we're talking about politics. So the other person's like, yeah, my French is terrible, but I really care about politics, and they were much more successful and included in that community, right? And so this brings up this idea of use versus exchange value, quid pro quo, alienation, etc. Moving beyond that toward things that are really kind of interesting. A couple of design features that I think we could do more with pedagogically. This is from the gaming literature. It's called structured unpredictability. So before you think, okay, I don't understand what he's talking about. Classrooms function in highly routine ways. People have the same chairs. The teacher comes in the same way and stands in front, then slowly everyone shuts up, or they say something, and then it's one person talking to a bunch of people, and then with explicit permission, from the teacher, students can do other sorts of things. And it's this called the episteme idea. So we want to structure interaction. We want to support interaction. But the thing that you remember is unpredictability. When something happens you do not expect, that's what's sticky. That's what you will never forget. Everyone knows where they were when. Think about the world event of some cataclysmic proportion, and you're like, oh God, I was at home watching on TV by myself, I called my friend immediately. Okay, tell me anything else you did at that time of day, any other time within those 3 or 4 weeks around that period, and you're going to be like, I have no idea, right? Structured unpredictability. Create conditions that are not utterly and boringly predicted, right? Situated language use of events, where there's some passion or desire line that would take students potentially in this direction. Experience and interest or passion driven, however, we have a huge role to play. Teacher amplified, right? So we'll talk about how to do this, but teachers can amplify things that happen when students also follow desire lines. So here's a great example, and this is, many of you may already be doing this, so it's not supposed to be that new. Rebecca Black, myself, and Shannon Sorrow, and a bunch of people, Sirpa Lepanen, a lot of people have done work on fan fiction, right? Fan fiction is super cool, and I'm starting with this one because it's the closest to what we want. Beautiful, polished, first-person narrative prose, or third-person fiction, right? And there's all varieties of this. It focuses on absolutely polished and meticulous writing, right? So focus on surface level orthographic and grammatical accuracy, which we fetishize in the academy, right? But you get students failing high school English in the United States. Eva Lamb has some work on this, who are writing 400-page novels in fan fiction communities online. So failing English, can't pull themselves to write like a 5-paragraph essay, and are publishing 400-page novels. Same. So, this, my friends, is reconciling the inertness of some learning contexts for some students, and also looking at the ways in which other contexts with very similar outputs, beautiful narrative prose, emergent in volume, right? So I think this is really interesting. And there are a whole bunch of ways you can orient to this. You can, have people review fan fiction sites or sources of basic media. Naruto is one of my favorites. It's a Japanese anime thing. Harry Potter is the largest fan fiction in the world, right? Students can choose a fandom. They can write with an online intercultural exchange class. So you guys can choose. You can get together and say, hey, a bunch of us want to do anime, a bunch of us want to do Harry Potter, or whatever. Shannon does this, and I'll pull up her slide in just a minute, with students in Sweden. And you can actually have them produce mixed language texts, or 2 translations, if you will, or interpretations of a given text, but in 2 languages. You can have all kinds of things. And then, I love this idea. This was given to me by a student of mine who teaches writing now. You can also do a genre reframe. So they write something that's action-oriented, where in the story things are happening, right? So you write that fan fiction first, where things are happening, then you step back and you do a third-person expository prose version, a journalistic prose version. So if you were a journalist witnessing this scene or reporting on this scene, how would you write it in newspaper journalism, right? As opposed to narrative fiction, right? So you can really start playing with this, right? And the outcome can be massive hours of effortful engagement. And what do we know about effortful engagement and large volumes of it? It leads to learning, development. Yes, that's the thing that leads to learning. Large volumes, not of casual, distracted engagement, but effortful engagement, yeah? So here's Shannon's piece. You can see there 2014, but she actually has this task-based language learning approach, and some really nice approaches to actually incorporating this. And I know this is not new. You should already be thinking about this, I hope, because it's a really great idea.
Can I just
do
a plug really quickly? Shannon Sauer has a module published in the Connect website on that you can consult in English, Chinese, or Spanish.
Exactly. Who wouldn't want to have your students explore Conchita verse? This is 2014, of course, it's 2018 now. But Dejan Kovic and I have a piece on linguiscaping, how, and as we discovered here, linguistic engagements that propagate beliefs, opinions, and ideological positions, forming an agentive process of constructing and contesting possible ethno-linguistic identifications and power relations. And believe it or not, you might throw up just a little bit in your mouth if you read through some of the comments fields hanging off YouTube videos of the European Song Contest. But it is amazing. You should see what sort of semiotic agility you find there. It is seriously interesting. And it's also vulgar, and so you have to, no, I mean, some of it is. Some of it is really reprehensible. And some of it is amazing, right? Writing the quote-unquote same thing, but to 3 audiences. In Russian, with Cyrillic, in Russian, but in Roman transliteration, and then in English. But they are not saying the same thing. And the ways in which they're pitching the quote-unquote same idea to these different audiences is fascinating. So you can have students engage in checking that out and potentially contributing. We have a whole bunch of work going on in massively multiplayer games. I've been very active in this space. And fundamentally here, you can just have students play. It doesn't really matter what, as long as it is a multiplayer game with lots of language in it. And so Dota 2, Defense of the Ancients, you have a multiplayer online battle arena. And this comes from a website associated with that. I talked about Dota. This person says, "This game taught me about the diversity of cultures that our small little corner of the universe offers. Then it taught me to hate them all." And the reason I like this is at least it wasn't just like rosy, yeah. I mean, you're actually confronting not culture as some sort of monolithic C2, but as performed by other players, and you turned out not to like it. So I'm not saying xenophobia and hating all other cultures is a good thing. What I'm saying is these games can confront in ways that might be making culture or intercultural communication visceral. Any of you play Fortnite, or your kids play Fortnite? If any of you have kids, this is the new cool game on the block. My son plays, and he's trying to get me to play. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of a quasi first-person shooter, so it's a little bit. It's not blood and guts. It's more distance than that. But they have very strong female protagonists, and you, at the beginning anyway, are randomly assigned a male or a female avatar. Believe it or not, took long enough to get here. Brand new. This doesn't normally happen, right? It's all male avatars typically. So my son plays a female presenting avatar, for example, and loves it. And it's great. I think it's a really interesting game. You need, for this to be useful, voice over internet protocol, and you need to play in teams, and you can do it as dyads or larger groups. But the talk there is super interesting. There's been a bunch of work on World of Warcraft. I've done a lot myself. And you find things like transcultural interaction and corrective feedback in synchronous chat in World of Warcraft. So here you have people actually correcting each other. And you have people giving corrective feedback about what to say next time they want to do a leave taking using Ukrainian, right? Which you wouldn't expect to find in an online game. You also find that gameplay is often embedded in broader semiotic contexts, like strategy websites, all produced by players, and artifacts like narratives, another term for fan fiction. And some of the largest fan fiction communities associated with gaming are in this World of Warcraft area. And you have people producing 100,000 word novels about World of Warcraft, an online game, admittedly Tolkien-esque with a big backstory and everything else, in a fan fiction community. So lots of symbiosis here. And this piece right here, strategy websites, Constance Steinkuhler's done a lot of work here. You have a massive production of scientific discourse. About half of the messages to the discussion board she analyzed, and there were 2,000 total messages that she looked at with Sean Duncan, her then grad student, involved some sort of evidence-based logical analysis. And some fewer number, 10 or 20%, use formal scientific methods. Hypothesis testing, hypothesis generation, hypothesis testing, success or failure state, if failure state, return, new hypothesis generation, new hypothesis testing, success or failure, et cetera, right? And this is by and for gamers, for fun, in their spare time, not at school, right? So you could utilize any of these sorts of dynamics, and I'm sorry for the laundry list here, but any of these sorts of dynamics that you thought might be interesting for your students, have them play as an extra credit activity, right? And if the game, as they play it, doesn't use much language, then you need to soft mod it. You know what this is, soft modification? It means you create a culture of use around playing this game. So don't skip over the quest text, read the quest texts. Or if you're playing, make sure you play in a guild. And that language spoken in that guild should be one that you're interested in learning more about. Or you need to publish in strategy websites and then include those in classroom assignments so that you can see that you've been engaging in scientific discourse in Catalan or in French or whatever as part of your activity for this playtime. And it could kill it. There's always this balance, right? If you take a desire line and you punish people too much for taking the desire line, they'll go back out of the path, right? And just walk along like a dog. So you have to be sensitive to these things too. But that can happen when you have people who really like playing games. These are my kids who I do let play. And they look. I mean, seriously, this is like they just found a quest giver. That's what this little sign is, and they're so happy. So there is a lot of joy for people who play these games, especially together. So say all of this stuff, online gaming, and even fan fiction communities, it's like, it's too much. You know, I know, losing control, all that stuff. But Bessemer and Kress, this is Gunter Kress, for those of you who might be familiar with that multimodality literature, talk about a generosity of recognition. You know, we live in a tiny little piece of the semiotic universe. Formal academic discourse, largely in classroom context. There's a big world out there, and our students will be using language in all kinds of contexts. So meaning making and learning, everything else, we really need to open up our recognition of the value of these other ways of utilizing communicative activity, right? You can also learn from students. When your students do something that you know anything about, and you're like, whoa, instead of that, why don't you just say, interesting, so let's see how this goes, and then learn. And if it's really a bad idea, shut it down. I mean, you are the keystone species of your information and learning ecology, which is your classroom. If it's not working, then don't do it. But don't not do it without doing a little bit of investigation, or letting your students do investigation for you. Make them provide evidence that this is a semiotically rich, challenging experience that they are learning from, right? The onus is on them, right? And if this is still a little difficult, there are some models for this. John Reinhardt and I have designed this so if there's some environment, whether it's a game or fan fiction or whatever, check it out. Collect some texts. Explore those texts and analyze them. Then think about creating and participating, right? I'm not going to walk through the whole model. The idea is have your students, as they grow across the lifespan, they will be entering new workplaces. They will be making friends in different cultures. They might be learning new languages. And they will need to figure out how to adapt their semiotic repertoire for those conditions over the entirety of their life cycle. So let them practice, right? Let them practice at getting good at paying attention and figuring out what semiotic assets are going to work for them. There's a bit that might need to be said about the criticality piece here. Bonnie Norton and Ron Darwin have written quite a bit about this. This notion from Bourdieu, sans pratique, that enables learners to gain awareness or mastery of the rules, so pay attention and figure out how these communities are discursively structured. Utilize these resources, right? And figure out how to do that within your community. And also, the third one, utilize linguistic and non-linguistic resources, not only to gain access to, but also to potentially challenge or transform these spaces. You're playing an online game, you see, and this can happen, misogyny, for example, is a global problem. So if you see this happening somewhere, utilize the resources you're developing to contest that, to transform that community. That's part of what it means to be a more powerful communicator. It's not just, ingratiating yourself into or socializing into an existing community, but also transforming it, helping it develop, helping it improve. Last couple slides here. So in these online environments, language socialization is culture in the wild, right? So a line from Garrett, as a developmental process, language socialization, so being outside in the wild, if you will, as a language learner or user. Language socialization is much more than a matter of learning to produce grammatically well-formed utterances. It is also a matter of learning to use language in socially and pragmatically appropriate, locally meaningful ways, and as a means of engaging with others in the course of, indeed in the constitution of, everyday interactions and activities. In other words, what you do in an organism-environment relation model actually transforms the environment. You are creating your own discursive conditions, right? As you communicate and engage, right? So the last little bit here, Durkheim, remember we talked about this? Normativity is a social fact, but one that is enacted, meaning it's done, it doesn't pre-exist you. You actually do that, and also treat it as polymorphous or shifting, right? And here's from Paul Hopper, so this is really languagey for you all, right? What adults know and what children learn is not an abstract system of units with meanings and rules for combining them, but integrated normative modes of interactive behavior and accompanying social uses of corporeal signs such as words and gestures, to which concepts like language and grammar are almost entirely secondary. This is reverting us back to this sort of primordial condition of the phenomenological awareness of the condition that you're in as a sentient being, right? And paying attention to that. Okay, there's a bunch of stuff that in this book by Sebastian Duvrel and myself on social pedagogies that try and do a lot of this, mostly in non-technology contexts, that you can look at if you're interested. And I'll just conclude, this is my last slide. For scaling up, yeah, that's fine. Language management system platforms, tools, tasks, databases, evaluation rubrics, all this is really important. And honor and learn from students' digital desire lines, right? Engagement in the wild, as Hutchins described 20 years ago, 23 years ago, should better inform our construction of learning environments, right? And vernacular tools, no way, potentially create opportunities for all kinds of things. Moving students from simply consumers of knowledge, like they are in classrooms, to producers of knowledge in communities or affinity spaces, right? And forging interpersonal relationships is significant. If there's one factor that drives people to learn more, it's usually relationships with other people, right? So how can we do that in classes? And that's what I leave you with right now. Thank you very much.